कथितां भगवता नारायणेन स्वयं व्यासेन ग्रथितां पुराणमुनिना मध्ये महाभारतम्.
May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Peace, peace, peace. So we shall begin today looking at some of the important themes in chapter 13 of the Gita. The Gita is not superstitious, nor was Krishna superstitious, so there is a 13th chapter in the Gita. They didn't skip from the 12th to the 14th. And as we have seen, that the main teaching Krishna has already given in chapter 2. And then from chapter 3 onwards, it's an extended question-answer session. And so therefore, as we see in most other chapters, the chapter 13 also begins with a question. Chapter 13 is given the name Kshetra Kshetrajna Vibhaga Yoga. Vibhaga means the distinction or the difference. So the distinction between Kshetra and Kshetrajna. So the yoga of the distinction between Kshetra and Kshetrajna. Simply translated, Kshetra means the field and Kshetrajna means the knower of the field. Now what these terms mean, Kshetra and Kshetrajna, that is what this chapter will discuss. In the very first verse of this chapter, Krishna is waiting for Arjuna's question, and that's why the chapter begins with Arjuna's question. Let's look at verse number 1. Arjuna uvacha prakritim purusham chaiva kshetram kshetrajnameva cha etat veditumicchami jnanam jneyam cha keshava. Arjuna said, Prakriti and Purusha, also the Kshetra and the knower of the Kshetra, knowledge and that which ought to be known, these, O Keshava, I desire to learn. So, Arjuna is saying really three things. He wants to know the distinction between Kshetra and Kshetrajna. He wants to know the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti. And he wants to know the distinction between knowledge and that which is to be known. Now, so there are three different questions in a sense. Now, these three things are related. So what these three things mean, what their relationships are, and what the distinction is, all that will be discussed in this chapter. And therefore, although these three distinct things are questioned, the chapter itself is named after Kshetra and Kshetrajna. So what are these things? So what Krishna does, in the beginning, he will discuss the distinction between Kshetra and Kshetrajna. Then he takes up the distinction between knowledge and that which is to be known. And finally, the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti. So keep this in mind. Three things, Kshetra Kshetrajna, Purusha Prakriti, and Jnanam and Jneyam. So in some versions of the Gita, this first question, which I just now read, the first shloka, is omitted. So some versions of the Gita may not have this first verse. And so the Gita begins with what I am going to read now, what will probably be in some of your editions the first verse of the Gita. And so if you didn't have the verse that I just chanted, assume that based on this answer of Krishna, this was the kind of question Arjuna may have asked. Because sometimes it's a little bit like you start watching a program, after the first 2 minutes or 5 minutes are already over. And then you find someone is responding to something. Now, you haven't heard really what the response is to. But looking at the response, you can kind of speculate what may have been the question or what is being responded to. So, the question of Arjuna is what I read earlier. Now begins Krishna's answer to that question. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Idam Shariram Kaunteya Kshetramitya Etadyo Vettitam Prahuhu Kshetrajna iti tadvidaha Kshetrajnam chapimam vidhi sarvakshetreshu bharata Kshetra kshetrajnayor jnanam yatyajnanam matam mama. So the question was, what is the difference between kshetra and kshetrajna? Now, one speculation about why the first verse, which is really Arjuna's question, may not be in some versions of the Gita, and this is just pure speculation, is that the word kshetra and kshetrajna appears for the first time in this chapter. It has not come in the earlier chapters at all. So it seems a little bit presumptuous for Arjuna to say, what is the difference between kshetra and kshetrajna? And Krishna would have simply said, I never referred to kshetra or kshetrajna. So from where is this question coming from? So one other response to that will be, maybe Arjuna had heard of kshetra and kshetrajna somewhere else before coming to the battlefield, because he certainly didn't hear it in the battlefield itself. In the first 12 chapters, there is no kshetra or kshetrajna. Anyway, this is just speculation of the reason why that question of Arjuna may not have been phrased that way, or it's in some versions and not in other versions. So what is Krishna replying? So now these verse numbers are going to create some confusion. So I'm going to assume that the question which Arjuna asked is not there in most versions of the Gita. So the chapter begins with Krishna's answer. So first two verses which I read just now, translation is, this body, O son of Kunti, is called Kshetra, and he who knows it is called Kshetrajna by those who know of them. Me do thou also know, O descendant of Bharata, to be Kshetrajna in all Kshetras. The knowledge of Kshetra and Kshetrajna is considered by me to be the knowledge. So what does it mean really? So first of all, asking for distinction between two entities, knowing the difference between two entities, is possible only when we look at things closely, look at things carefully. Otherwise, we may not know the subtle realities involved in those things. For instance now, if I am seeing a tree, if I look at a tree, I will see a tree. Well, that's pretty obvious. But if I look at the tree more carefully, once I look at the tree carefully, then I see something more than a tree. I see there branches, leaves, flowers. I might see some birds. And if I'm very careful, I might hear the birds chirping. So, just looking at a tree, I just see a tree. But looking carefully, I'm able to see these distinctions. The branches, the trees, the leaves, the birds. Now, if I look at the tree even more carefully, if I go closer and look at the tree even more carefully, I might notice some ants moving up along the trunk of the tree. I might notice some tiny insects. I might be able to gauge the age of the tree. I might be able to see or look or make sure that the tree is getting its proper nutrients so that it can grow healthily. So all of this depends on how closely and how carefully I look at the tree. So in order to distinguish, to see things clearly, to know what is what, to be able to distinguish the branches from the leaves, the flowers from the fruits, I need to look carefully. Now this ability to look carefully and to be able to make distinction between distinct entities, this is what in Sanskrit is called viveka or discernment. And looking at ourselves is not different from looking at a tree. Now if I just look at myself, what do I see? If I look at myself, and really the best we can do is just like look this way, or better, stand before a mirror. So if I want to look at myself, what I do is I stand before a mirror. And I think that I see myself in the mirror. But that would be a very superficial looking, and therefore what I would see is only a very superficial me. Now if I begin to look a little bit more carefully, just the way I looked at the tree, a little bit more carefully, then I'm able to see something more. Beyond just this physical appearance, I'm able to see there's someone inside, someone with hopes, with ideas, with emotions, with feelings, someone who has dreams for the future, someone who's carrying a lot of memories and thoughts. I'm able to see all of that if I'm able to look at the person more clearly. And here in this instance, the person is just myself. Now, if I look at myself, go closer and look even more carefully, then I might discover there someone or something I may never have seen before. And that is my own true self. That is what Krishna refers to in the Gita as the Atman. So it all begins with looking carefully. Looking superficially, I'll just see the outward layer. If I look more and more carefully, go closer and look carefully, I will see the inner essence. So in order to now know the distinction, because Arjuna's question is about just the distinctions between Kshetra and Kshetratya, between Purusha and Prakriti, between knowledge and the thing to be known. Now in order to know that distinction, you need to look carefully. Go closer and look carefully. And that is what Krishna is emphasizing here. So he says, if I look carefully, then the kshetra, the field, will be this body. Now, I must say something about the word body. The word that is used in Sanskrit here is sharira. Now in English, when we use the word body, just usually mean, well, this thing, body. But the Sanskrit word sharira gives us a better idea of what body means. So sharira in Sanskrit etymologically would mean shiryate iti shariram, that which wears away, that which is perishable, that which doesn't remain constant. So if I then look carefully at myself and find what are the things that wear away, that are never constant, and the physical body is an obvious candidate for that. We know it's changing all the time, and you don't need any explanation for that. We just see, right? If you just line up all the photographs of yours from the time you were born, you are looking different in every photograph. You say, take a photograph every year of your life, you're going to look different. So physically we are changing, that's pretty obvious. If you have your health records from childhood, our weight is changing all the time also. So yes, that's pretty clear. But we're not just the body, not just the physical body. As I said, if you look carefully, inside this physical body, we know there is another one subtler part of my personality. My mind, my feelings, my emotions, my thoughts, my memories, my hopes, my dreams, my fears, none of those are constant either. They are also constantly changing. The kind of thoughts we thought when we were little children, teenagers, those are gone. Newer thoughts have come. Old fears may have left, newer fears will have come. Well, some old fears may still be continuing. So, but we are at the physical and mental level, we are a continuously changing mass. Things are constantly going away and fresh things coming in. So therefore, both the body and the mind, both are bodies. Therefore, sometimes to distinguish between them, the body is called the gross body, the tangible body, sthula sharira, as contrasted from the mind, which is sometimes called the sukshma sharira, or the subtle body. Simply because, well, the physical body is what we see, and the minds and the thoughts and emotions and feelings is what we feel, but you can't see them the way you see the body. And therefore they are subtle. So subtle body, gross body. Sthula sharira, sukshma sharira, but both are sharira, both are changing. Now what Krishna is saying here is, they both are kshetra. Now kshetra means field. Now why a field? Simply because it's in a field that fruits grow, that plants grow. That's where you do your gardening. That's where you do farming. And when you do farming, that's where fruits come. And some fruits will be bitter, some fruits will be sweet. Well, those are the karma phalas. Now, all of the fruits of karma are experienced in the body and mind. And because they are experienced in body and mind, because the fruits of karma essentially at the experiential level are nothing but just joy and sorrow, sukha and dukkha. And sukha and dukkha are experienced only in the body and mind. So the body and mind are therefore called a field here, where these fruits, these karma phalas come up. So this body is called the kshetra, and one who knows it is called a kshetrajna. Now the knower of the body, the knower of, again, when I say body, remember, I'm referring to both body and mind. The knower of this physical part of my personality, both the subtle and the gross material part of the body, material part of my personality, one who knows it is called a kshetrajna. Now, the knowing ability, matter doesn't have the knowing ability. Knowing is something that occurs only through consciousness. In fact, consciousness is knowledge. So here we have a clear distinction, therefore. The body, mind are material, are products of matter. In Sanskrit, they simply call jada, as opposed to consciousness or chaitanya or jnana, which sees, which knows this material thing. So we see that our human personality, therefore, can be distinguished between a material part and a non-material part. Now, I will know this distinction only if I look closely, only if I reflect over it, only if I look at the body and say, well, if the infinite reality is unchanging, it's always present, it has no beginning and no end, then this body is not the eternal reality. The body has a beginning. This particular body, in this particular configuration, really had a beginning. That's what means being birth. And the body, as it is constituted now, is going to become non-functional and going to return to dust or a heap of ashes. So it will have an end. And during this interim period between birth and death, this body is continuously changing. Therefore, it is different from consciousness. Consciousness has no beginning, no end, and it is constant. There is no change in consciousness also. Now, people sometimes speak about consciousness as a variable thing, that you have an intense consciousness or a low consciousness. Now, those are words that are used partly because the word consciousness itself is understood by different people in different ways. A lot of times the word consciousness gets so identified, associated with the brain activity, that the intensification of brain activity or the clarity or the lack thereof are often then superimposed on consciousness itself. But the way consciousness is understood in the Gita and in Vedanta texts in general is that consciousness in itself is a constant. It never changes. It is beginningless and endless. But we will know this distinction only if we look carefully and look deeply. Therefore, viveka is what we need. So this verse, Krishna's verse, first verse, he simply says, the body and the mind are the field, and the one who knows this field, one who is conscious of this field, is the kshetrajna. So that's a very simple and direct answer that Krishna gives to show the distinction between kshetra and kshetrajna. And then in the second verse he says, I am the kshetrajna in all these fields. That's a very fascinating observation. Now, we will see that, well, there are billions of bodies. Sometimes people think in terms of only the number of bodies in this planet. We don't have an exact number, but that surely will go in a few billions. But here, bodies of not simply human beings is mentioned. If you add to it, because every living entity is a body. And so there are not just human bodies, there are bodies, animals have bodies, insects have bodies, microorganisms have bodies. Now, there has been no census ever taken of all these bodies. So the number is huge, unimaginable. And remember, we are just thinking about the bodies on this one tiny, insignificant, little, miserable planet in this huge universe. Now, are there more bodies elsewhere? We don't know. That's what some scientists feel, whether there was some life, signs of life on Mars and so on. So it's still in the speculative field. The Gita doesn't go into that. But one thing we can say for sure is that if it's possible to have bodies here, living bodies on this one little part of the universe, no one can say with any degree of certitude that there will not be life or there will not be any living bodies anywhere in the universe, or there are living bodies anywhere in the universe. You just don't know. There may be, there may not be. But to close the door to this question and say that either way we know it fully would be wrong. All that we can say, which would probably be very logical, that if something is possible somewhere, then to declare that it's impossible anywhere else seems a bit too much of an assumption to make. In any case, the important point here is that now I might think, well, this is the body, and the consciousness within is the knower of this body. But then every one of you has a body, and then there is consciousness in you who is the knower of your body. And therefore it might appear that there are as many units of consciousness as there are bodies. There are as many knowers of the bodies as there are bodies. And the second verse, Krishna demolishes that idea. He says, no, that's not how it is. There could be gazillion bodies, there could be like innumerable bodies, but I am the knower in all of them. Now, some people might take it literally, Krishna as a person, which just seems a bit difficult to understand. And what most Vedanta students understand by this is that whenever Krishna uses the word I, Krishna is referring to the real I, the I that he referred to in the second chapter, that is the Atman. But it's in the singular. So he says, I, the Atman, is the knower of all these bodies. Now, so how do then, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like your Atman is same as my Atman. You just feel like we are different people. We just have different bodies, different minds, and different everything. And the example often given in Vedanta texts is of, Sri Ramakrishna gives it as well, and it's given in many commentaries to Upanishads as well. That is, if you have, let's say, 10 containers filled with water, and you place them out into the garden, and the sun is overhead. Now, each of those containers will have a reflection of the sun inside. And to an untrained mind, you would think, well, there are 10 suns here. But in reality, it's just the reflection of this one sun. So that is how this one Atman, one principle of consciousness being present in every living body in this universe is often seen as a reflection of that one Atman everywhere. And that is what Krishna means here by saying, I am the knower of that field. This Atman is the knower of this field, and there may be many fields, but the knower is always one. And knowing this, knowing what is the field and who is the knower of the field is, that is knowledge. So that was another question of Arjuna. What is knowledge and what is the object to be known? So he says, well, everything material in this universe, that is the field. The knower of the field is the Atman, pure consciousness. And knowing the distinction between the two, that is knowledge. All other knowledge may serve some purpose in life. Knowledge is sacred. Jnana is sacred. And so it does serve some purpose in life. But let's put it this way. Certain kinds of knowledge will solve certain kinds of problems. Or certain kinds of knowledge will remove certain kinds of ignorance. But our other ignorance might still remain. It's like, let's say, I do not know how to operate a certain gadget. Let's say I need some tech support. So something is wrong with my computer and I need tech support. So I'm ignorant about how to fix it. So I go to a tech expert and say, to call them up or call them home. Well, nowadays it's very difficult to call anybody home. So maybe just call them up over the phone and say, oh, this is the problem. How do I fix it? So the very fact that I'm asking someone for help shows that I'm ignorant about how to solve the problem myself. Now, if the person on the other side, the tech expert, is the knower, he or she will say, okay, do this, do these steps, and then I find that my problem is solved. So that knowledge that I got from this tech expert teacher has removed my ignorance about how to fix this problem. Perfect. But I'm still an ignorant person. There are a lot of other things I don't know. So that knowledge has not removed lots of other parts of my life I'm ignorant about. Now, is there any knowledge by which all of my ignorance will go? Instead of trying to acquire bits and pieces of knowledge here and there, which might solve bits and pieces of my problems here and there, is there a knowledge that will remove the problem once and for all? Now, in order for me to do that, again, I need to look deeply inside every problem. Because we said in the beginning, viveka, discernment, the more carefully I look at something, the greater knowledge I have about that thing. So, sometimes people might say, well, life is filled with problems. True, it's filled with problems, no doubt about it. But should I look upon all problems as just many problems and try solving as many problems as you can? And sometime or the other, I'm just going to get exhausted or going to run out of time, and which is what happens. I mean, think of it this way. Emails is a major problem for many people, especially those who get lots of emails. And then you say, well, this problem never seems to go away, because as often as you reply to your emails, more emails keep on coming. So that seems like a perennial problem. Those who do gardening, weeds are a perennial problem. No matter how many times you do weeding, fresh weeds will come. So there's no end to problems. So if I look deeply at all of these problems, and that's what Vedanta students have done for centuries, and they have found, if I can go to the root problem, the basic problem, then solving that basic problem from which all of the problems have sprung up, I'll be able to solve the problem once and for all. And so the basic problem they have found is the inability to distinguish between kshetra and kshetrajna. The inability to distinguish between that which is material and that which is non-material. Now, why should we distinguish between the two? Simply because the two are polar opposites. Matter has to follow the laws of matter. Therefore, it is under laws. And whatever is under any law is not free. It's governed by that law. It has to follow that law. Now, non-material entity, which is what consciousness is not under the law of matter. It's not governed by that law. It's free. So, material entities, not free, governed by laws. Consciousness, not material, no laws, is free. Material entities constantly changing. This is never changing. This has the beginning and an end. This has no beginning, no end. Now, if I'm able to distinguish between these two, a lot of the problems can be removed. Now, in order to distinguish between the two, as I said, I have to look carefully. And then I discover that the real problem is that this material and the non-material, the perishable and the non-perishable, they have somehow gotten mixed up. That is the problem. Now, if they were simply mixed up, I might be able to remove that mixture. But if they are mixed up in such a way that I am not able to distinguish between them, if they are mixed up in such a way that the imperishable has simply been covered, then it becomes very difficult. And that's really what has happened, because we look at ourselves and we just see the body when you stand before a mirror. You have to really look deeply inside to know that now, beyond whatever is inside the body, beyond whatever a surgeon might find when the body is cut open, there is something more to me than that. Then we see the mind, the intellect, the ego, and everything that is included in all of those things. But we might stop there. Remember that story that Sri Ramakrishna used to tell about a woodcutter, that a woodcutter would go every day to the woods, cut some wood, and then go and sell it into the market. And then he thought, this way my life has to continue all through life, because I have to go. Unless I go and cut some wood and sell it, I won't be able to earn my livelihood. And then one day he meets a teacher who is very pleased with this earnestness and sincerity of this woodcutter, and then tells him, you know what? You are going to a certain part of the forest, cutting wood and coming back, and you think that's your life. But have you ever thought of going deeper into the forest? Go further inside. Don't stop. Keep on going. You might find that that may change your life. So this woodcutter takes those words of the teacher to heart and says, yes, that's true. Every day I'm going to a certain part of the forest, cutting my wood, and I'm spending pretty much most of my life doing that. I've never even tried to go deeper into the forest to find what is there. And so now, inspired by what his teacher had told him, the woodcutter says, today I'm not going to stop at the place where I normally go. I'm going to go deeper. So he goes further inside the forest. And then to his astonishment, he finds there a sandalwood, a bunch of sandalwood trees. Now, sandalwood is much more expensive. It can bring a lot more money. And this woodcutter is thrilled. I'm going to now earn like 50 times, 100 times of what I used to get before. So he immediately sets to work, starts cutting the sandalwood trees, and then bringing them and then selling them, become very wealthy. And so happy that he obeyed his teacher's instructions that he went deeper and found those sandalwood. A few months passed by. Then, when he's again sitting one day and thinking about what his teacher had told him, it suddenly strikes him that his teacher did not tell him, go further inside and find sandalwood trees. The teacher had said, go further deep. That's all. So he said, my teacher didn't tell me to stop there. And I've not even ventured further because I was so happy I found these sandalwood trees. And so we read then this woodcutter goes further, deeper into the forest. And then he finds silver. Silver mining is possible there, and becomes even more wealthy. Again, a few months pass by. And then the story goes on to say, then he finds gold, and then he finds diamonds. So the deeper he goes, the further he goes, remembering that the teacher had not asked him to stop there, the greater the benefit that comes to him. Now that applies to us. Every one of us is that woodcutter. Now if I just spend all my life looking at myself in the mirror, then this is just the wood that I'm going to find. But then the Upanishads say, the Vedanta teachers say, go deeper. And as I said, you look more deeply. So going deeper here is not a physical going, obviously. It means looking deeply, looking at the subtler, inner, more profound parts of our personality. And that's when I look deeper and then remember that this body is only the outer shell. But inside this body dwells this mind, filled with emotion, filled with feeling. There is prana, there is a life pulsating in this body. Because if this life, prana, which is inside goes, the body can't do anything. That's what happened. What is a dead body? What is the corpse? Well, there is the body. The body hasn't disappeared anywhere, but the prana has left. And if the prana leaves, the body is useless. Can't do anything. In fact, if you don't do something with that body, it will just start putrefying. It's awful. That's why we just go and bury the body or cremate it. Because prana is inside and prana has left. So then we look deeper and find inside the body there is a prana. Now, if we think, well, prana is everything, you say, no. You look further inside, you go deeper, just like the woodcutter, go inside, and then you find there is a mind. So you go further inside, and there you find then buddhi, or this sense of agency, the ego as an agent. You go further inside, and then you find again that ego as an experiencer. There is someone inside experiencing whatever this world has to offer. The sukha, dukkha, every experience that we have at every level, there is someone within experiencing it. So that bhokta, the ego as the experiencer, that who is also inside. So the deeper I go, I'm able to see these different layers of personality within me. Now, layer, the word layer, in Sanskrit it's called kosha. That's why we say and then don't stop at that. Don't stop at the ego. Right now, when I say I'm doing this, it's just that ego. But further inside, don't stop. Remember the woodcutter story. The more you go inside, then finally, I will stand face to face with the real me, the real Atman. That is the real me, that real Atman is the knower of the field. Everything else before that, the ego, the mind, the buddhi, the prana, the body, that is the field. So kshetra and kshetrajna, field and the knower of the field. Knowing that distinction, Krishna says, is knowledge. Because if I know that distinction, and if I know that I am the Atman, all my problems go away. The Atman has no problems. The problem is with the body. The problem is in prana. Sometimes you feel depleted of energy. You feel weak. That's because the prana is somehow not strong. Sometimes I feel sad. I feel miserable. That's the qualities of the mind. And all these tendencies we have. I need to do this. This is my duty, my responsibility. That's just the ego as a karta, the ego as an initiator of activity, and then the bhokta, all the experiences I have in life. Now, all these things are only layers, and all problems in life are connected with these layers. So once I know the distinction between the layers and the real me, and knowing that that real me is free from problems, that Krishna says is real knowledge. So, in a way, the entire essence of the chapter is really given in these first two verses. The distinction between kshetra and kshetrajna, the field and the knower of the field, the material part and the non-material part. How matter might appear to be many and different, but the knower is always the one. And knowing the distinction between these two, that is knowledge. So, Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhu. Let's look at the questions now. How do we know for sure that brain activity is superimposed on consciousness rather than the other way around, where consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity? We cannot know for sure in an objective way. we just know it by the results it produces. So there are already people who think that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain, and there are people who believe that brain activity is superimposed on consciousness. So there are these at least two schools of thought. And one is free to follow either school of thought that makes sense to them. The worldview of a person who looks upon consciousness as a byproduct of the brain will be very different from the worldview of the other person. When the Gita and the Upanishads describe a person who is enlightened, a person who is considered a Jivan Mukta, that person's worldview is that consciousness is independent and free. It's not a byproduct of the brain. So that is the kind of result we can expect if we follow that way of thinking, and if that way of thinking makes sense to us, as opposed to the other way of thinking. So there is no way of objectively knowing in advance whether this is right or that is right. One is free to follow either of those ways depending on what makes sense to them, but they will attain or they will get different results out of that way of thinking. Next, can you speak more to when you say the mind is a part of the sharira? Isn't the same mind carried from body to body? So how can it be perishable? The mind is perishable, but it doesn't perish with the same frequency as the body, the gross body. So this body that we have will disappear. Well, not disappear in the sense of just gone, not in that sense, but the lifespan of this body is the lifespan of a human being. So when prana leaves this body, then this body perishes in the sense that it will be reduced to dust. But the mind, being finer, lasts much longer. So the mind will perish when a person becomes enlightened. So the mind remains for a long time, much longer than the physical body, but it will also ultimately perish. So both are perishable. One perishes rather quickly, and the other will perish only upon enlightenment. That is why it is perishable. So they don't perish at the same time. And therefore the mind, as the questioner put it very correctly, it's the mind that is the receptacle of all our memories and all of our karma and the karma phalas. And because the mind is carried from one birth to the next, we don't begin every life with a clean slate. We got a fresh, new, updated body in every birth, but the mind is old. And therefore people are different because we come with the different contents in our minds in every birth. Next, is Prakriti the same as Maya, as God with attributes? Well, the word Prakriti gets used in scriptures in many different contexts. Here, Prakriti means everything that is different from consciousness. But towards the end of this 13th chapter, Krishna will go into details about what the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti is. So we will discuss more about Prakriti as we go further into the chapter. Next, do desires arise at the level of Kshetra or Kshetrajna? Everything arises at the level of Kshetra. Desires and everything, all movement, desires coming and going and rising and not rising, all this change and activity can occur only in the field. So it happens in kshetra, but the kshetra is incapable of anything unless it is in the proximity of kshetrajna. So you need the presence of kshetrajna, you need the presence of consciousness, but the activity occurs in matter. That's how it is. One other point regarding the body and the mind that we discussed before. A rough analogy to the body and the mind could be this physical body is the hardware, if you like, and the mind is the software. Now we know that a software has a much longer shelf life than a hardware. A hardware will break down more quickly. That is why you need to change your computer every few years, but the software that your old computer had can continue. It will need to be updated, but the software doesn't die the way, well, the person who makes the software could die, but the software itself lasts longer than the software maker. Next, am I not using my mind, a material entity, to know the distinction between the field and the knower of the field? Absolutely. We are using the mind to know the distinction between the kshetra and kshetrajna. But again, going back to what I said before, the mind by itself cannot do anything. The mind in the proximity of consciousness, that alone is capable of doing anything. The interesting thing is this. The consciousness by itself cannot do anything either. There is no doing there. The doing part is in the body and mind. That which makes that doing possible is in consciousness. So consciousness, it's, what I'm reminded of is like sometimes they give the analogy of a blind person and a lame person. Now both are handicapped in some ways. Well, a blind person can't see, a lame person can't walk. So, but if they work together, then they can do what they individually cannot. And so there were stories in our childhood about how the blind person carries the lame person on his shoulders, and so the lame person has eyes, so lame person will tell the blind person where to go, and the blind person has legs. So that way sometimes together we might be able to do things that individually we may not be able to do. So it's not a perfect analogy, but you kind of get the point. Consciousness doesn't do anything. Matter does everything. By themselves, matter cannot do anything. So matter and consciousness, if they come together, the proximity of consciousness makes the matter capable of doing things. Okay. Now here the question is, am I not using the mind as a material entity to know the distinction between kshetra and kshetrajna? Yes. It's a tricky part. In the Upanishads, we read that consciousness, that ultimate reality, is beyond the reach of the mind, beyond the reach of the senses. It's called avang manasa gocharam. So the question can be, how can mind be instrumental in knowing that which is beyond the mind? So as opposed to avang manasa gocharam, that which is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses, the Upanishad also says, manasaivedam aptavyam, manasa eva idam aptavyam. This thing can be attained only with the help of the mind. Now, again, on the face of it, these two statements are mutually contradictory. To say that something is beyond the mind, and then to say, well, only with the help of the mind you can get it. That's where we need experts to explain us what this means. And Shankaracharya in his commentary says, Susamskritena manasa, that ultimate reality can be reached only with the mind that is purified, a mind that has acquired that clarity to see. That is where I spoke before about looking deeply, having that viveka and vairagya, both discernment and detachment, which will give the mind the ability to then know the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti, between Kshetra and Kshetrajna. So good question. It's also been answered by Vedanta teachers in the way I just explained. Where does true knowing takes place? Is it an experience? Is it in the mind? The knowing takes place in the mind because ignorance is in the mind, and if that ignorance in the mind has to go, knowing also has to take place in the mind. Again, taking place, whatever takes place or whatever doesn't take place, everything happens in the kshetra, but happens in the proximity of consciousness. It's a little bit like all the activity that we see that occurs during daytime occurs on this earth, right? But what makes the day a day? The rising of the sun. So we need sun's light in order for us to see things, and in that light we can do a lot of things. In the light of the sun, the plants grow. Now, the sun is not actually coming down and helping the plants grow. Sun is just being the sun. Sun is not doing anything. Sun is not even saying, let me give light. Sun is not saying anything. It's the nature of the sun to give light. So the sun is just being the sun. But just that presence of the sun, that presence of that light makes so many things possible here. Exactly in the same way, consciousness is not doing anything. It's just being consciousness. It's just being itself. But because of the presence of that consciousness, everything becomes possible. So the knowledge occurs in the mind, but that knowledge occurs in the mind because of the presence of consciousness. Next, can we think of material and non-material mixed in this way, like salt and water, that can be easily separated? How do we separate them? Yeah, that is the kind of a distinction sometimes students in chemistry do. What is the difference between a mixture and a solution? That is, when you combine salt and water, that's a mixture because you can separate salt and you can separate water. But if you combine an alkali and an acid, then what you get is salt and water. And once that chemical reaction takes place, the resulting solution, you cannot then go back to the original constituents. So when you cannot go back to the original constituents, it's no more a mixture, it's kind of become mixed together completely. So this analogy is good. It is like salt and water. Or it's also unlike salt and water also. It's a little bit tricky. Now, salt and water to the extent that, yes, salt is different, water is different, they mixed and we can separate them. Up to that point, you can say these are same. Where they are not same is that salt and water can be mixed. It is possible to make a mixture of salt and water. It is impossible to make a mixture of material and non-material entity. Impossible. So, well, if it's impossible, well, it does happen. Now, if something is impossible and it does happen, or it seems to happen, means only really one thing. I'm just dreaming about it. Right now I'm sitting here and now suddenly I find myself in Hawaii. The only way that's possible, either if I fall asleep here now, enter into a dream and I'm in Hawaii. that way. So it's not impossible. But the only way for it to become possible is I need to start dreaming. So material and non-material entities forming a mixture, really impossible. But what if the non-material falls asleep and starts dreaming and thinks of itself as material? Then in the dream they can be mixed up. But when the non-material wakes up again, it's oh no, I was never mixed up with it. That's it. So the saltwater analogy is great, but there is a slight distinction from it. Does devotion give rise to knowledge? Since the last few chapters were extolling devotion. Yes, of course. Ultimately, the goal is clarity of mind. Or what in devotional texts gets described as purity of heart. They are not two different things. Purity of heart and clarity of mind are one and the same. What devotion will do is produce this purity of heart. And that's why I said that blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So if my heart becomes pure through devotion and God's grace, of course knowledge will come. How does a finite mind know an infinite consciousness? No, finite mind doesn't. It's like this. It's not the mind that is knowing consciousness. It's consciousness knowing itself. The mind cannot know anything. Knowledge is not in the mind at all. Mind is only an instrument. But if the mind becomes pure, then through that pure mind, consciousness can know itself. The mind doesn't have to be infinite. I mean, look at it, the window. Now, the window has a pretty small dimension, but standing near the window, I look out and I see a much larger area, a much larger landscape, which is much, much bigger than the window. So the window doesn't have to be of the same size of what I see outside the window. So through a limited mind, but a mind which is purified, that consciousness can know itself. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.